right, so a lot to talk about tonight, and we're going to do a little speculating. But I thought, first of all, I don't have a lot of articles to go over, but I think the big thing everybody's wondering about is this whole Ukraine-Russian thing, and kind of hard to say. But before we get to that, and we'll just take a look at a couple of scriptures that may give us some insights. But last week we were talking about the food shortage and the grain shortage and the wheat shortage and meat's going up, and just when you thought, well, chicken, we're going to eat chicken, we're going to eat turkeys. Here's the latest thing I just came across. That chicken producers warn about fast-spreading bird flu spreading across the U.S. Has anybody heard that?
No.
Yeah, and just today, this bird flu, let me just read a couple of things here. U.S. poultry producers are tightening safety measures for their flocks as disease experts warn that wild birds are likely spreading a highly lethal form of avian flu across the country. The disease is already widespread in Europe and affecting Africa, Asia, and Canada, but there's an outbreak in Indiana, which is on a migratory bird pathway, particularly rattled U.S. producers. A devastating U.S. bird flu outbreak in 2015 killed nearly 50 million birds, mostly turkeys and egg-laying chickens in the Midwest. The United States is the world's largest producer and second largest exporter of poultry meat, according to the U.S. government. An outbreak of bird flu in Indiana, which is on a migratory bird pathway, has particularly rattled producers. Everyone is just sitting on edge because we know what can happen and we don't want a repeat of that. Poultry company Purdue suspended in-person visits to farms to avoid spreading the disease, etc., etc. So it's a fear. But then today I read an article, and hopefully I can read my notes. But farms that raise chickens and turkeys, and obviously eggs, are on high alert, taking steps to prevent an outbreak that, again, we already know, killed 50 million birds. Was discovered in a commercial flock in Indiana on February 9th, which resulted in the killing of 29,000 turkeys. And then they go on to say turkey and chicken prices could rise if birds at enough farms are infected. And I also read somewhere that, what's the largest producer of chickens?
Purdue.
No, not Purdue.
Tyson.
Tyson had an outbreak in Kentucky. I don't know. I thought I had a note on that, but it was, as I recall, 250,000 potential birds. They don't know yet. They're testing. So we don't know what that means, but it just, to me, is not a coincidence that all this stuff just seems to be happening. So we'll have to wait and see on that, but it's just one more potential thing. When it gets to the next issue, Ukraine and Russia, it's kind of touch and go right now whether or not Russia will move. I did hear a lot of congratulatory or a lot of positive comments with President Biden's talk today. He was firm. He was tough. He made it very clear that Russia's really playing with fire. But we're going to have to wait and see on that. 150,000 troops amassed around Ukraine, all the way up into Belarus on the west and east, to the south, and the Black Sea. They have ships. They've even began to, which I find to be kind of disturbing, to bring in ships into the Mediterranean. I don't know if anybody heard of Amir the other day, but the Mediterranean, which is obviously off the coast of Israel. So, if we go through Scripture, we don't see anything about, we see wars and rumors of wars, but those are ethnic groups. People groups against people groups, like the Shias and the Sunnis and the various people groups that'll be battling against each other as we get toward the end. But there's nothing that, most of the wars in the discussions of wars in the Scripture deal with Israel. That's really what we need to pay attention to. And here's just a couple of interesting things that I picked up on. And the title of this is, if Russia invades, Israel will get caught in the crossfire, says a senior Ukrainian official. And it says it will affect everything from bread supply, construction. Israel's high-tech industry could be impacted if tensions continue to rise. Israel will get caught in the crossfires if there's an escalation between Ukraine and Russia. Explain how Israel will be affected if Russia moves forward with an invasion and Ukraine ceases its exports to Israel. For starters, Ukraine supplies half of Israel's grain supply. Cut your bread supply in half to understand how Israel will be affected, she said. Israel's infrastructure and construction industry would be greatly impacted as Israel imports a large amount of metal from Ukraine. Also, Israel has outsourced many high-tech jobs to Ukraine, meaning that an income source for thousands of Ukrainians could be cut off. This could obviously adversely affect Israeli companies. A senior Israeli official said that should Ukrainian Jews want to take refuge in Israel but not obtain citizenship, it would be permitted, as Israel was established in order to be a safe haven for Jews. So there's quite a number of Jews in the Ukraine, and as we know, as we get closer to the return of Christ, that God's going to stir the hearts, and who knows what way or ways to motivate Jews to return to Israel. So obviously there's an open door for Jews to go to Israel. Pointing out that Ukraine has a very strong Jewish community, Israel is going to have to demonstrate support for Ukraine in her plea that Israel join her side. This is from an official in the Ukraine. The first is political solidarity with my country. Well, this is asking for, basically it sounds like this authority from Ukraine is asking for Israel to side with the Ukrainians, which would not be in their best interest. Another article, Israel walked between the drops amid Russian-Ukraine tension. The perceived Western Europe notion that a major war cannot again occur on the continent is quickly dissipating as Russia continues to threaten war with Ukraine. The threat is not going away and could materialize at any time. We are in the window. Any day now, Russia could take military action against Ukraine, or it could be a couple of weeks from now. Or Russia could choose to take the diplomatic path. At least 6 ships have entered the Black Sea to boost its combat power. Concerns abound that a full-scale invasion by Russia could result in as many as 50,000 civilian casualties and force some 5 million Ukrainians to become refugees. Israel currently maintains a delicate balancing act as it works to preserve its good relationship with both Russia and Ukraine. So they're right in the middle, so which way do they go? Dima Kors, a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies and Political Science at Ariel University, told JNS this situation is specifically challenging from the Israeli perspective because of our alliance with the U.S. However, in most scenarios, the Israeli leadership will have enough space to maneuver between both sides. Kors suggested this maneuverability is important since both Russia and Ukraine are significant partners of Israel. So, we need to pay attention to how this impacts Israel, because that's really what the Bible's all about. What's Israel and how's Israel going to fare in all this? So let's turn our Bibles real quick to the book of Ezekiel, and we're going to get back into Daniel. And I'm not going to do an in-depth study of Ezekiel 38 right now, but I'll just give you some ideas that came to my mind. And of course, this is conjecture. But what we do read in Ezekiel 38 and 39 are events that will definitely take place. And I'll get to that in a moment. But remember a couple of weeks ago or a month or so ago, we read Ezekiel 36 and we read Ezekiel 37. and Ezekiel 36 and 37 relate primarily to Israel again becoming a nation. The dry bones. That's what the image of the dry bones is all about in Ezekiel 37. That these bones coming back together symbolizes Israel once again becoming a nation. And it's really all about that. And it's for God's name's sake that he's bringing them back. And so it does say that, just a couple of reminders, that when the Jews do start to return to Israel from the four corners, they will come back largely, as we said, in unbelief. They come back as unbelievers. When we say unbelief, they've not yet accepted Jesus Christ, but they will. That's what we're going to get into Daniel chapter 9. That's what the tribulation is really all about. It's all about Israel's repentance and coming to Jesus Christ. So they have to come back in unbelief, which is exactly the way things have been going. Now, the gospel has spread, and I was listening to someone just the other day that says that there are now in Israel over, I think he said 200 evangelical churches or communities, as opposed to just 50 or so not that long ago. So the gospel is spreading. But for the most part, the Jews have not yet accepted Christ. That's what the tribulation, as we'll see when we get to the tribulation, is really all about. So after they get back into the land, and Israel becoming a nation is kind of a benchmark. It's kind of a clue about really, I'm not going to say a new dispensation because it's not a new time period, but about the beginning of the end. When Israel became a nation in 1948, that was a signatory benchmark period of time. And so when they become a nation, it's at that point when God begins to bring the Jews back to the land. And I think, as we've mentioned, in 48, there were some 600,000 at that time Jews living in what we know to be tiny little Israel today, which is just a small percentage of what God has given to them, and they'll ultimately get back. But today they're approaching 7.5 million, I think, is the latest number. So the numbers have really exploded, and interestingly, they continue even in times in which we live to migrate back from wherever they are, from the four corners, like Jeremiah refers to the four winds, to the north, the east, the south, the west, and exactly as God had said. After they get to the land and they become a great nation again, and Ezekiel 37:10 says that they came to life, speaking about Israel, stood on their feet a vast army. So it even prophesies that after Israel becomes a nation, they will again develop and have a vast, powerful military, which we know they have today. They're one of the strongest militaries in the world, but there's only so much they can defend against. And so one of the things that we read about in Ezekiel, after they become a nation, as they begin to come back, that after a period of time, and this doesn't say specifically when it's going to happen, but there's going to be a Confederacy of Nations. We've talked about that many times, I think, that are going to attempt to move against Israel and defeat them militarily. And that's what we read about in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And the participants in this confederacy are primarily Turkey, Russia, and Iran, and also Libya and probably Sudan, which is a little questionable right now. But those five nations will come together to militarily move upon Israel. And as we said before, Ezekiel recorded this prophecy roughly 2,600 years ago, when Judah, Israel, Jerusalem was still in a state of ruins, having been basically overtaken by the Babylonians, had not yet been coming together, and Ezekiel was a contemporary of Jeremiah and Daniel, so it was in that particular time period. So he's looking forward to a time when Israel would again be a nation, have a powerful army, etc., and all of these other nations would come together to move upon Israel. And with the exception of Russia, the one thing that those other nations have is that they're all Muslims. Now, I think as we said before, as we get close to the end of the age, there's going to be periods when things really speed up. I think like we've seen in the last couple of years, so much happening. And then they'll slow down. There'll be ebbs, there'll be flows. So we don't know precisely when all this is going to take place. But what is noteworthy is, again, for the first time in recorded years, we have military, we have the three main players, Iran, Turkey, and Russia, with a presence in Syria, which is to the north of Israel. That's never happened before. And it's just yet one more indicator of how close we are. And what is significant among everything else that's in this prophecy is that Russia kind of takes the lead. They're the only non-Muslim part of this confederacy, if you will. And the leader of Russia, his name is referred to in this prophecy, or his title is Gog, G-O-G. So the leader of Russia, a.k.a. Gog, will be the one that will lead this confederacy against Israel. Now, the leader, and if you go through and you look at where Rosh is, which is one of the participants, and where they lie geographically, north of Israel, etc. You see that all laid out very precisely in Ezekiel 38, and you see that Gog, the leader of this confederacy, can only be one person, and that's the leader of Russia. And here's what's interesting as we go. Let me just read a couple of verses, because I think we see a very good clear clue here, because what we're seeing right now is Vladimir Putin, and I'm not saying he's God. I'm not saying he is the leader. He could be, and I think there's a fair chance he is. But again, we don't know for sure. He could be replaced tomorrow if something were to happen to him. But some leader, and it has to be a person of that certainly does not have a biblical view of things. So some leader of Russia, and certainly Putin does fit the mold of who's going to be God. And what I find to be very interesting is just in the last year or so, he's began to amass this military presence around Ukraine. And he's doing it for a couple of reasons. Number one, NATO was formed to be an alliance of nations that protect themselves as a confederacy against Russia. And so we've got Ukraine that at one time was a part of the Soviet Union, that he feels, number one, should not be allowed into NATO. And Ukraine really right now doesn't have a desire to go into NATO or become a part of NATO. But at any rate, he worries about that. Also, Ukraine is to the south, primarily south and west of Russia, and has access to ports in the Black Sea, and has a lot of strategic importance as far as Russia and the former Soviet Union is concerned. What he wants to do, which is he's already done it with Belarus and Crimea and other places, is to bring back the one-time Soviet Union. And so right now we're in a time period, if you think about it, another, I think, thing that we need to really contemplate is there are no real leaders in the world today. I mean, Macron goes over and meets with Putin. He's virtually laughed off the stage. He's the leader of France. And you have all of these others. Netanyahu is no longer in place and has been replaced by a very weak government. I mean, we can say what we will about number 45, but I can almost guarantee if he was still in office, this would not be happening. But we have a leader now that I think in part at least has motivated Putin to do what he's doing. And so there are no real leaders. And what does that mean? It means that the time will come, I believe, in a not too distant future when the world will clamor for a leader that will solve all the world's problems. And perfect opportunity for Antichrist to come on the scene. And all this, and Jesus references distress of nations in the Olivet Discourse, which means that things will become so perplexing and difficult that leaders will run out of answers. And so you see that really happening today with all the things we've seen take place throughout the world and continue to take place, some of which are beyond humanity's control. This thing about I'm not saying that the bird flu is from God or anything like that. I would never say that, but there's some things that are just outside humanity's influence. And it's just all of these things coming together at the same time. So Ezekiel 38, and what I'm seeing, the point is I'm trying to make, and this is just me talking. I'm not saying that I'm right, because the world is looking at this from the world's perspective, and we're looking at it from a biblical perspective. And I don't know if anybody heard the latest talk between, it was just a quick half hour, 45-minute overview of things going on with Jack Hibbs and Amir Sarfati, and how Amir said, he was asked a question by Jack. He said, people in the world tend to say, well, how can you believe in the Bible? The Bible is this is non-believers talking. The Bible is just myths and allegories and this and that and everything else. And Amir's response was, which I think we would all agree to, I pay a lot more attention to what I read about in the Bible than I do in world news or in the headlines, or I don't care what the news source is, because this tells us everything we need to know. And so what we see here, I think for the first time, is Putin beginning to do things that he hadn't done in the past. And his true colors are coming out. And I think if we look at the first, I'm not going to go through all of this now. We'll get back to Ezekiel 38 later. But beginning in 38:1, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, set your face against Gog, the leader of this confederacy, of the land of Magog. And Magog was one of the sons of Japheth that you read about, I think it's in Genesis 5 or 6, somewhere there. And the descendants of Magog ultimately moved to the region north of Israel. And so we have the descendants, ultimately the Scythians, who became ultimately, after a couple of thousand years, the land of Russia. Set your face against Gog, who was this leader. And Gog appears again at the end of the tribulation. So Gog not only is a person, but I think it's an evil spirit that controls this person. So set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. Prophesy against him and say this. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Gog. Again, Gog, the leader of Russia, who was the leader of this confederacy that consists of Turkey, Russia, Iran, Sudan, and Libya that we know today. I am against you, Gog. Or we could say, just for the lack of a better way of putting it, I am against you, Vladimir, or whoever. This is clearly, definitely only can be the leader or a leader of Russia. There's no other. You go through the demographics and everything. That's the only thing that this person can be. I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. And here's what's interesting. God is going to do it. He is going to orchestrate this confederacy to advance upon Israel. God is going to turn Gog around. He says, I am going to put hooks, this is metaphorical, obviously, in your jaws and bring you out with your whole army. And I heard it explained one time that when this was recorded, then one group of people or one tribe would capture or overtake another tribe and kill as many off as they could, that there were usually few people left. And what they would do is that they would take big thorns and fashion them into hooks and put them into the jaws of their captives. And it kind of tied them all together in a line. And then one person, all he has to do is just give it a little tug. And those guys will follow him anywhere. So that's the metaphor, at least that's what I've heard, that is being used here. That Gog is just going to put some kind of motivation or thought into Gog's God, into Gog's mind. And I will put the hooks in your jaws and bring you out with your whole army. So this is going to be a vast ground force of troops that are going to move on Israel. And it's going to be God who's going to turn them around. And if we're going to read the whole chapter, we'll see that God has a very definite purpose for doing this. Because God, at the end, and he always reveals himself, or oftentimes reveals himself through how he deals with Israel. That's what God does. I am going to reveal myself, and that was the purpose of Israel. They were chosen for many reasons, of which is for God to reveal himself through them. Remember, you all the way back to the Abrahamic unconditional unilateral covenant. Even though they fell and sinned against him, that he is going to use them and he's going to bless them and so forth. I will turn you around. God's going to put these hooks in his jaws and bring you out with your whole army, your horses, your horsemen fully armed, a great horse with large and small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. Persia, which today, of course, Persia is Iran. Cush, which is the Sudan, is basically south of Ethiopia in that area over there. And Put, which is Libya, again, all Muslim states, all Muslim nations, with the exception of Magog, will be with them with all their shields and helmets. And Gomer, with all its troops, and Beth Togarmah from the far north with all its troops, the many nations with you. So Gomer and Beth Togarmah are generally believed to be Turkey. So if you look on a map north of Israel, you'll see Turkey, and then you'll see Russia, and to the east you'll see Persia. They're all going to come together under the leadership of Gog. And so while we see all this stuff going on, this is just me talking, with the Ukraine, I just don't think it's coincidental that Putin is beginning to move now. I just don't. I mean, yes, it's not been his MO. I think it's always been in the back of his mind. But now things are happening, and it's just not coincidental that it's happening at the same time. We see all this globalization, the one world, the pandemics, and all the other things that have taken place at the same period of time that it's just coincidence that it's happening. It's just my view. And so get ready, in verse 7, be prepared, you and all the hordes gathered with you, and take command of them. So in other words, Gog, leader of Russia, be ready. I see right now, I think that what's happening, this is just my view, and I could be wrong, but I think that God is beginning to motivate Russia, Putin, whoever, to be in a position to do this. Because if he were to go in and take over Ukraine, if that happens, and I'm not convinced he will at this point in time, but even if he doesn't, he's still going to make life very miserable because they surround Ukraine, and he's going to put economic sanctions. And I have heard that, anybody hear that there was some kind of cyber attack in Ukraine just today? So he's begun to do things. They haven't confirmed that it was Russia that did it, and not even sure what that cyber attack was against, but it was reported that there was a cyber attack, and they're investigating to see where it comes from. But it seems probably pretty clear that Russia did that. And, if you want to hear what Jack and Amir say about what could happen. I'm not going to get into that because it's a pretty frightening scenario if anybody listened to it, in terms of the potential for major conflicts that could emanate from all others. But we'll have to wait and see. And again, remember, and the United States doesn't play a role in God's end times plan. We're part, if you go all the way back to the book of Zechariah, you'll read that all nations will move against Israel at the Battle of Armageddon. That doesn't mean some nations, but all nations would include whatever might at that time be left of the United States. And so it just seems that with the focus right now, at least in the Bible, on Israel and the revived Roman Empire, the 10-member nation, Antichrist, Russia, Persia, all these other entities, that the United States really can't be there as a superpower. Right now, we're still a superpower militarily. We've got some pretty serious weapons, but things could happen. And I believe, I don't know what they are, or when, or anything like that. And I'm hoping, obviously we're praying, that it happens, whatever happens in the United States happens after the rapture. And, you talk about triggering the tribulation. Imagine when the church is just suddenly gone. And there's going to be a period of time when there's going to be 144,000 Jews that will begin to evangelize during that period of time. But there has to be a pretty short, maybe not so short period of time when the gospel is not here, when nobody is preaching the gospel. It's just the church, which in 2 Thessalonians says that we, the church, are restraining. We're the restrainer. We're holding back the full force of God's wrath, which is going to come. Gomer with all its troops, Beth Togarmah from the far north with all its troops, the many nations with you. Again, I keep coming back to the fact Gog is clearly the leader of Russia. Magog is clearly Russia. Persia, obviously Iran. Beth Togarmah and Gomer, Turkey, and for the first time ever, they all have a presence in Syria, which is just to the north, because it says in verse 8, after many days. So this is God speaking to Ezekiel, telling him that at some point in the future, that's after many days, is in the end times, you will be called to arms. In future years, you, Gog, and your Confederacy will invade a land that has recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations. And so this couldn't happen if Israel wasn't a nation. And they've been gathered from many wars. And clearly, the only nation in the world where the people have returned to from many nations is Israel. And it goes on to say, to the mountains of Israel. So I'm going to bring you to the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. We've talked about the fulfillment of those prophecies, Jeremiah and Deuteronomy and so many other verses in Scripture talked about Israel becoming desolate and barren, and the the Jews being scattered. But it's just amazing since 1948, particularly, how much has happened. So they have been brought from the nations, and now all of them live in safety. So there's a lot of speculation about what that means. I think some translations say peace and safety, but do the Jews feel like they're living in safety now? I think they do. I mean, they have such a strong military, but, it would seem to me that with, particularly with anti-Semitism exploding all over the world, that they may not feel like they're in safety for much longer. So another reason why this could be very close. You and all your troops and the many nations with you will go up, advancing like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land. So this is a picture of this nation, of this confederacy moving on Israel. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On that day, thoughts will come into your mind and you will devise an evil scheme. I find that to be very telling. I really do. That Putin now is beginning to show his true colors. I don't know if God's putting these evil thoughts into his mind. I don't know where he is with Israel right now. I think he has a pretty high regard for Israel, but he's also has agreements with Iran, and Turkey seeks their assistance, plus other things on the energy front that could do. I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates. I will plunder and loot and turn my hand against the resettled, that's where we are now, ruins, and the people gathered from the nations. Clearly that's happening. Rich in livestock and goods, living at the center of the world. And I think it's in, Ezekiel 5, where Israel is referred to as the navel of the world. The very center from God's perspective of the world is Israel. And so they're at the center. And it goes on to say something very interesting. Sheba and Dedan. Sheba and Dedan represent basically Saudi Arabia. It would be Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, the United Arab Republic, United Arab Emirates, rather, and those other nations in that Arabian Peninsula. That basically they're going to say, have you come to take a plunder? Have you gathered your hordes? So this is a description of the merchants of Sheba and Dedan basically asking, and Tarshish and all her villages, have you come to plunder? Have you come to gather hordes to loot, to carry off silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods? And I think in some translations it says, have you come to take a spoil? In other words, are you moving on Israel for what reason? Are you taking what they have? And with the gas in the Mediterranean that Israel has, and the potential for maybe Nord Stream 2 gas line not to be, there's just a lot of potential things that could happen that would cause Russia to move. But what's interesting is these nations basically, and the purpose of putting this in here is to say, we're not going to do anything. We're just wondering why you're doing it. We're not going to participate. We're not going to defend Israel. And it's interesting that these nations, which is Saudi Arabia, you might say 15 years ago, might be inclined to cheer this movement on, or to because of the hatred of Israel at the time, or to possibly even participate. But today we live in a time when we have all the agreements between Israel and the Emirates and all these other nations, which has only been in place for the last 4, 5, 6 years. And so that kind of fits in as well. And then it goes on to say, references the merchants of Tarshish. That's Spain, and this is where some people, and I don't know if it's right or not, but some people tend to place the United States, that we're the young, and in some translations it says young Tarshish and young lions, and some people say that Tarshish was Great Britain. A prophecy about the future of Great Britain, and the United States was a young lion, and it will just be basically like Sheba and Dedan, just kind of taking a laissez-faire approach to this, and not willing to support or to defend Israel. And I can tell you, under 45, this definitely could not have happened, because we absolutely would have militarily, if it had happened then, backed Israel. Today, I'm not so sure. I think that we had a pretty good example of how we might respond to something like this with Afghanistan. I think that was a pretty good indication of how the United States could respond. But clearly, nobody's going to come to Israel's support for a very good reason, and that is that God is going to himself defend Israel. Son of man, prophesy and say to Gog, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In that day, there it goes again, it wasn't for Ezekiel's time, it was for a time in the future when Israel was again a nation and the people were moving back and so forth. When my people Israel are living in safety, will you not take notice of it? You will come from your place in the far north. So you look at a map, point directly north of Jerusalem, and you come smack dab into Russia. And many nations with you, all of them riding on horses. Obviously, Ezekiel couldn't see tanks or however they're going to do it on foot or whatever. You will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. In the days to come, Gog, listen to this, I will bring you against my land. Why? So the nations may know me when I am proved holy through you before your eyes. So God knows the hearts of Gog. He knows that basically, it's an unchristian place. Russia is, and certainly Muslims are, and they don't know Jesus Christ, and so he is going to bring them down. He's going to motivate Gog to move upon Israel, and it says here, as we just read, I will bring you against my land. Why? So the nations may know me when I am proved holy through you. Now, if we go to Ezekiel 39, I won't read too much more. I'll just read a couple of verses here because the King James actually gives a clearer depiction of what's going to happen. Son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Gog. And again, we could say Vladimir or whoever. It's got to be the current or future leader of Russia. And again, am I saying it's Putin? Could be, maybe not. Chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. I will turn you around and drag you along. In other words, I don't know if right now Putin even knows that he's going to make this move because God's going to put the thought in his mind. Something's going to motivate him. Turkey right now is having a lot of their own problems, but Iran, if they were asked by Russia to move on Israel today, they do it in a heartbeat. So would Libya. Right now, Sudan's a little shaky because they're trying to get involved in these Abrahamic Accords, but a lot of uncertainty and unrest there. So most of those other nations, if told or asked or led by Putin, would move on Israel in a heartbeat. It says, I will turn you around and drag you along. So God's going to motivate Gog. He's going to put the hook in his jaws and pull him against them. He says, I will strike your bow from your left hand and make the arrows drop from your right hand. On the mountains of Israel, which is basically north of Israel, that's the Golan Heights primarily in the northern parts of Israel, you will fall, you and all your troops and all the nations with you. I will give you as food to all kinds of carrion birds and the wild animals. You will fall in the open field, for I have spoken, declares the Lord. I will send fire on Magog and those who live in safety in the coastlands, and they will know that I am the Lord. I will make known my holy name among my people Israel. I will no longer let my holy name be profaned. So what is God saying here? He's telling Ezekiel that I'm going to cause this confederacy to move on Israel, but they're only going to get so far, and then I am going to destroy. That's why these other nations are not going to be allowed to participate in any defense of Israel, because God's going to reveal to the world that he is faithful to his promises to Israel, and this move on Israel will be designed to wipe them out. And but for God, is JD would say, but God, he has a plan, and he's going to protect them, and he's going to make sure they survive. And so he's going to destroy this confederacy. And in the King James, it says that 5/6 of this confederacy will perish and fall into the valleys and the ravines and so forth. They're going to turn upon themselves. There's going to be an earthquake. It's going to be devastating. And it kind of sounds like, although it's, it's have to wait and see, that very few, if any, Israelis will perish from this. But the Confederacy, and this is what God's going to do. And so he's doing it to reveal to the world that he is God. I mean, people are going to say, what the heck happened there? Is it, there's just no explanation. And many, I think, will realize that God did it, but still, it's interesting as we go through the book of Revelation that even with the judgment being poured out and people shaking their fist at God, they still won't accept him. So while people will see up close and personal, I think that God did this, that God protected Israel, that he defeated this confederacy. Even though the nations will know, there's still going to be many that won't believe. They won't see it. But I was just going to spend a few minutes going over this, but it just something that came into my mind. I haven't really heard anybody else speak about it this way. Maybe they have, but it just seems to me that with everything going on and with Putin beginning to puff his chest out and do what he's doing, because if he were successful, and we don't know what's going to happen, but let's just say he does and he's successful, then where's he going to go after that? He doesn't have to go that far, because Syria, he's got to take control of Syria, because right now you have competing forces in Syria with primarily Iran, the Syrians, and he wants Syria because of the ports and whatever else there is. It's another strategic location for him. So he's got himself all puffed up if he goes, even if he doesn't. This is just step one, I think, in the future of what's going to happen in the Middle East, and that's what we need to pay attention to. I don't know if Russia's going to move. I don't think anybody really knows. I think that Russia has an awful lot to lose, but who knows? I mean, many say that Putin could care less about sanctions. He's such a megalomaniac, and really, he's former KGB. He's a pretty ruthless guy, and so he may not care. But at the same token, it's possible that he's just maneuvering right now. He's just trying to. I mean, that's an awful lot of maneuvering to put 150,000 troops in place and tanks and everything else. But it would require that he back off. But I think the key will be if we hear that we and the rest of NATO agree that Ukraine will not become a part of NATO, then I think that's the one thing that might get him to at least temporarily back off. If we don't, and that's kind of really, from what I understand, Ukraine wants to join NATO, but that's several years down the road. So really, from a practical point of view, why not do it? Why not just say they're not going to join NATO, and that might help. And then he's got some other crazy demands as well. One thing that this is a sidebar. I heard Amir say the other day when he was talking to Jack Hibbs is that they have Russia has positioned at least one, and I don't know how many they have, of these hypersonic missiles. And a hypersonic missile can go, how many thousands of miles an hour? Yeah, like 5 times the speed of sound or something like that. And they're virtually undetectable. And they've somehow positioned at least one of these things near Ukraine. But as I said, it's certainly not a weapon that they need for Ukraine. They don't need a hypersonic missile to go against Ukraine.
In case anybody else.
Yeah, and I think it's a potential deterrent because we don't have that. China does, North Korea claims they do, Russia does. These hypersonic missiles, which can carry multitudes of payloads, which could be nuclear, could be conventional, whatever, they're the latest in technology and weaponry.
Why don't we have them?
Pardon me?
Why don't we have them?
I think that what happened, what I understand is that when, and I don't know all the details, but when China tested theirs not too long ago, that we were caught totally off guard. We were totally flat. We didn't know that they had it. So, but Russia has it as well. So I don't know.
Are we building them?
I don't know. I don't know.
They're researching.
Yeah. But it's kind of like, I don't know. I said there's no defense against them because they go so fast and radar can't really keep up with them. And, like with normal missiles and rockets, they've got missile defense systems, but not against these things. So they have at least one or two or whatever, positioned either to the south of Ukraine or whatever. And I've never seen one, so I don't know what they look like. I don't know how big they are. All I know is they're pretty fast. And I think it's just
question for you, just going back to something you said. Does our government have any advisors of biblical men that are advising them, as in the past?
Not the current. I don't believe the current administration does. I think the preceding did.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Pompeo, Secretary Pompeo had a Bible on his desk, and it was always open, and he read it. He knew the scriptures, as did a fellow from Texas that was Secretary of Interior, former governor, I can't think of his name, Pence, a lot of believers, and I think many of them knew what the scriptures say about the end times, about Israel. And I have to believe, I'm certainly not privy or on the inside, that but when number 45 decided to move our embassy to Jerusalem and declared that the Golan Heights belonged to Israel, I'm just guessing if he didn't know himself that his advisors were saying, here's what the Bible says. And we better support Israel. And nobody was a greater supporter of Israel than 45, whether you like the guy or not. He supported Israel and did things that I think, and then you think about how prosperous we were at that time. And really, it was kind of a good period of time, that 4 years. And how now we have an administration that have anti-Semites and others in the organization that are anti-Israel, and you see, it just seems that there's a definite correlation, at least in part, between our treatment of Israel and good or bad things that happen. I think, it's a lot more complex than that, but that's certainly part of it. All right, so we're pretty much eating up almost an hour. Any questions, comments?
Isn't it? I've heard this, that the Muslims have started to infiltrate the churches, and this is the starting of the fall of the churches, that they will infiltrate and with their beliefs, and there's more of them now than of us. And I forgot where I had read it, but they said.
Well, there's roughly in the world, roughly 1.2 to 1.5 billion Muslims, and they have been emigrating to places like France and Germany and Great Britain, and who knows what's coming over our border, different things. But if you consider, and this is not sure it answers your question, but they claim that upwards to 1/3 of all Muslims have believe in Sharia, believe in terrorism and all that type of stuff. If that's true, that's potentially 500 million. I think the percentage probably is less than that, because not every Muslim advocates strapping bombs. But if you've got 1.5 million, say it's only 10% that have those radical views, that's potentially 150 million. So it's certainly certainly a factor. And yeah, I don't know about infiltrating churches, but they are certainly, one of the goals they have is to overtake and to create a worldwide, what they call caliphate. That's their goal. So they are doing things to do that. But don't forget, when this event takes place and God wipes out 5/6 of them, that's going to put a real hurt on the Muslim population, because so many of those are going to be participate in that will be Muslims, which I believe probably will be the opportunity for Antichrist to come on the scene and enter into this agreement with Israel. I think that's my guess. And then the question is, will we be here for the Gog-Magog war? We won't be here for the tribulation. I happen to believe, I'm not dogmatic about it. I think Rick probably agrees as well, and others, that this Gog-Magog thing happens before the tribulation. So the question is, will we be here to see it, or will we not? I think, again, not that a mirror is the be-all and end-all, but I think he thinks that we'll be gone when that takes place. But, if that's true, it's going to be pretty darn close when you see the speed at which all this stuff in the Middle East is taking place.
How many people in Israel now?
About 7-8 million. I think they're close to 8. And I think I read that the Jewish population is pretty close to 7, which is getting pretty close to half the world's population. I think they are at about half the world's population. Jewish population now lives in Israel. Remember, God said he'll motivate them to move back. And that's what anti-Semitism. I was just reading an article the other day about exploding anti-Semitism in the United States, with Orthodox Jews being punched and kicked and called dirty this and dirty that in New York and other places. It's getting really nasty. It's almost approaching again, like the night of the broken glass before World War II in Germany. So it's not at that point, but you could see how we're moving in that direction, which is good, and it's obviously bad, but it is a way that God is motivating Jews to move back.
What's the timing of the wormwood hitting the earth? I just sometimes wonder if that's what's going to wipe out the United States. That's why it's not a factor in the end times.
You mean wormwood?
Wormwood?
Wormwood. That's during the tribulation. That's an event that happens during the tribulation. I think it's one of the bold judgments. Yeah. We're long gone when that happens. Yeah. And that probably will be an asteroid or a meteor or something. And wormwood is something that just comes in and affects the water supplies primarily, and the food. And you try to drink water, it tastes bitter, and that's where the wormwood comes from. But I think that's either a meteorite or an asteroid during the tribulation.
It wipes out a third of the earth, I think. So could that be what wipes out the U.S. and that's why they're not a factor?
I don't think so. No. I think that's part of God's judgments. That's one of the 21 judgments God's going to pour out during the tribulation. So it's clearly after the rapture. I think the United States, I'm not saying the United States is going to get wiped out. I don't think that's going to be the case, but I don't think we'll be the superpower we are today. Remember, every empire has an average life expectancy of about 200 years. We're over that. We're like 250. Not that we're going to follow all the others. And you can't be a nation that was founded on Christian principles and tell God, we don't want you in school, we don't want you in government.
We don't even want you in church.
Pardon me?
We don't even want you in church.
Right. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, exactly. Good point. Yeah. So, and it's like Billy Graham said, if he doesn't judge the United States, he owes Sodom and Gomorrah an apology. So, it can't go on like this. We just hit $30 trillion in debt. When you think about the impact of that, I don't know.
Which is
but the key.
It's a good point, because what brings an empire down is kind of keep an eye on the dollar and see what happens to it, because the world is due for a new primary currency. I mean, if you look at the historicity of the different nations, that form of capital, it keeps changing. I mean, prior to us, it was the pound, the English pound. And there are others that had preceded that, but the dollar is in such a precipitous position right now that it's due to come down. And you've got the Chinese yuan that's out there. You've got all this cryptocurrency stuff that they're starting to talk about. Just keep an eye on the dollar. That'll help you understand the health of the country.
DoorDash, I think it is, or Grubhub, one of them, is talking about going to Bitcoin to pay.
Oh my God.
It was on the news tonight.
Wow.
Yeah, we have to go to a digital currency, whatever that may be. And I know we talked about that a little bit last week, that every nation is taking a look at that.
But that's the first time I heard of one specific thing that is very close to making it.
There's
you're
all
gonna
kinds
pay.
of
Yeah.
all kinds of companies are considering cryptos.
I guess they're very close from
Yeah.
what they were saying tonight.
All right, well, let's wrap it up. Any more comments? We had a couple of questions out here. I think Megan had a question about God putting evil thoughts in someone's mind. I don't know if God's going to motivate Gog to make this move. And you have to remember that Gog is already evil. So it's just something that I don't know how it's going to work. And then Rob said, which I agree with, I think God will allow the evil thoughts to bring about his purpose. Yeah. And Satan needs permission to do that. I would agree with that. Good point. And then Megan says, how do we know the U.S. doesn't have them? Speaking of the hypersonic weapons. And I haven't heard that we do, but you're right, Megan. Maybe we do. I'm not. I don't speak for many.
They're under research.
Yeah, Rick's been studying, and he says that they're under research. Okay, so that's it, and we'll just finish in prayer. Lord, I just thank you for this time, and Lord, we covered a lot of material, but what we need to remember, you need to keep in mind, is that you are sovereign, you are in control. You tell us not to take any or to have any anxious thoughts, that you know the very hairs on our heads, that we're part of the bride of Christ, and that while there's nothing that says we can't experience difficulties or persecutions, in fact, you tell us that in John 16, and so, Lord, I just know, Lord, that we could, but we're not appointed to wrath. We're not appointed to suffer wrath, as we will see up close and personal when we study the rapture of the church. That is not for us to endure, and so we just thank you for that, Lord. Help us to keep what's going on in perspective, knowing that these things must happen. And you tell us that as well in your word, that these things must first take place. And so, Lord, we just thank you. We don't know all the details, and if we have overspeculated, please forgive us for that, Lord. And we're not trying to look at world events and tie Scripture to world events, but hopefully to take the Scriptures and see how the world events may play into this. So I ask that you bless everyone here.